July 16, 1959, 2:30 p.m. In room 5112 at Metropolitan Hospital, just 26 hours before her death, Billie Holiday made a strange request to nurse Margaret Davis. "Get me a recording device. I need to record my final songs." The 3 songs secretly recorded in that hospital room that day would remain lost for 60 years, and when discovered in 2019, they would shock the music world. In these final recordings, Lady Day wasn't just singing. She was confessing the real reason behind the FBI's 21-year surveillance, the suspicious circumstances of her death, and the secret she could never tell. But the most horrifying detail was this. At the end of the recordings, Lady Day's final words could be heard, and those words proved that her death was no accident. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the shocking truths emerging from these lost recordings. Because what Lady Day said in her final 24 hours will change music history forever. When Margaret Davis started her shift at Metropolitan Hospital on the morning of July 16, 1959, the 34-year-old experienced nurse knew that the famous patient in room 512, Billie Holiday, was in serious condition, but the determination in Lady Day's eyes that morning made her feel something was different. At 2 in the afternoon, Lady Day called the nurse over and began speaking in whispers. Her voice was so weak that Margaret had to lean her ear close to Lady Day's lips. "I need to ask you something," Lady Day said, struggling to breathe. "But you can't tell anyone, especially not the police at the door." Margaret nodded, waiting curiously. "Can you get me a recording device, one of those portable ones? I need to record my final songs." Margaret was surprised. Why would a woman on the verge of death want to record songs? But she couldn't say no to the pleading look in Lady Day's eyes. "I'll give you $500, Lady Day said. "But please bring it today. I don't have much time left." Margaret Davis would describe this moment in a 1999 interview. "That's when I realized this wasn't just about singing. Billie wanted to document something. She wanted to say something. There was fear in her eyes, but also determination. Like it was her last chance, and she couldn't miss it." Margaret went home that afternoon and got her husband's reel-to-reel recording device. As she returned to the hospital, she felt her heart beating rapidly. If she got caught, she could lose her job. At 4 p.m., Margaret Davis returned to the hospital with the recording device hidden inside a large bag. The police officers at the door routinely asked her, "What's in there?" "Just clean sheets and the patient's personal items," Margaret replied, her heart pounding in her chest. The police didn't check the bag. Margaret's face inspired trust. When she entered room 5112, she found Lady Day awake, looking out the window. "Did you get it?" Lady Day whispered. Margaret nodded and pulled the device from the bag. The process of setting up the recording device took about 10 minutes. Margaret found an electrical outlet and placed the microphone next to Lady Day's bed. "Let's test it," Margaret said and pressed the record button. Lady Day cleared her throat and whispered, "Test, test. Today is July 16, 1959. My name is Billie Holiday." Margaret rewound and listened. The sound quality wasn't great, but it was understandable. "Perfect," Lady Day said, smiling slightly for the first time that day. "Now we can start recording. But if anything happens, keep this tape. Don't give it to anyone, especially not the police." Margaret Davis would later describe this moment. "That's when I understood that Billie wasn't just going to record songs. She was going to confess something, maybe even accuse someone. I was scared but also curious. This woman was dying and wanted to record her final words. Who could stop that?" Margaret pressed the record button and Lady Day began to speak. When the recording started, Lady Day was silent for a few seconds, catching her breath. Then she began to speak. "I first sang this song in 1939. Since then my life has become hell. The FBI followed me. Clubs banned me. My loved ones left me. But I kept singing this song because it told the truth. Now I'm singing it for the last time. Maybe this will be the most honest version because I have nothing left to lose." Then Lady Day began singing Strange Fruit. But this version was unlike anyone had heard. Her voice no longer had that powerful full tone. It was barely a whisper. But every word was filled with pain, anger, and most importantly, truth. "Southern trees bear a strange fruit." Her voice trembled as she sang. "Blood on the leaves and blood at the root." Her breath caught, she stopped, she coughed. Margaret gave her water, but Lady Day wanted to continue. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Tears began streaming down her eyes as she sang. The most shocking part was at the end of the song. After the original lyrics finished, Lady Day continued. "Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, just like me hanging from society's disease. They lynched my people. Now they're lynching me. with needles and badges and pharmacy. These lyrics had never been heard before. Lady Day had added a new verse to Strange Fruit on her deathbed. Margaret Davis couldn't hold back her tears during the recording. "That's when I understood," she would say years later. Billie saw herself as a victim too. The system had lynched her as well, just with a different rope. After the first recording, Lady Day rested for a few minutes, drank water, and relaxed a bit under the effects of her morphine dosage. Then she told Margaret, "The second one won't be a song, it'll be a speech, a message for the FBI." Margaret's heart raced. This was dangerous. The police at the door were connected to the FBI. What would happen if they heard? But Lady Day was determined. "Start recording," she said. When Lady Day began speaking, her voice was slightly stronger than a whisper, as if the anger inside her was giving her energy. "Gentlemen at the FBI, I know you'll find these recordings one day. You've been following me for 21 years. You bugged my house, tapped my phones, threatened my lovers. Even my mother worked for you against me. Why? Because I sang a song, Strange Fruit. Yes, that song scared your system, because it told the truth." Then Lady Day's voice became even harsher. "But your biggest crime is this. You made me an addict. Dr. Martinez was your man. He gave me heroin, calling it painkillers. Did you think I didn't know? I knew from the start. But I was so lonely, in so much pain, that I took it. And then you had me arrested. You made me addicted. Then you blamed me. Perfect plan, wasn't it?" Margaret Davis felt her hands trembling as she listened to this part. This wasn't just a confession, it was an accusation. Lady Day was directly accusing the FBI of poisoning and manipulation. "Now I'm dying here," Lady Day continued, "and I know you're happy about it too. One more problem solved. But know this, these recordings will come out one day, and then the world will see that you're not just racists, you're also murderers. What's killing me isn't just heroin, it's you, your system, your oppression, your hatred." After the second recording, Lady Day was exhausted. Margaret told her to finish the recordings and rest, but Lady Day insisted. "One more song, one last song, then I'll rest forever." She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. Margaret pressed the record button again and Lady Day began her final song. This was a composition no one had ever heard, lyrics written by Lady Day herself. "I loved in the shadows, afraid of the light, because loving like mine wasn't seen as right. They said I was broken, they said I was wrong, but my heart kept singing its forbidden song." The song was about the secret loves Lady Day experienced, relationships not accepted by society, and most importantly, the price she paid for loving. Her voice was fragile and painful but equally beautiful. The final verse of the song was particularly striking. "Now I'm leaving this world where I never belonged, but my voice will echo in every protest song. To the ones who loved me in secret and shame, remember my music, remember my name." When Lady Day finished the song, there was silence. Margaret couldn't hold back her tears, and Lady Day had closed her eyes. A few minutes later, Lady Day spoke again. "Margaret, keep these recordings. If I die tomorrow, and I will, these recordings will tell the truth. What's killing me isn't heroin, it's this system. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded. "I understand, Miss Holiday. I promise I'll keep these recordings." Lady Day smiled slightly. "You're a good person, Margaret. Thank you." Those were the last words Lady Day said to Margaret Davis. The next day, July 17, 1959, at 3 in the morning, Billie Holiday died. 2 police officers were still waiting at her door. When Margaret Davis left the hospital that day, she took the recording device and tape with her. When she got home, she told her husband Henry everything. Henry initially said they should turn the recordings over to the police, but Margaret insisted. "Billie entrusted them to me. I can't give them to the police. They work with the FBI." They eventually stored the recordings in a safe place in their basement and never mentioned them to anyone. As the years passed, Margaret listened to these recordings a few times. Every time she listened, she remembered Lady Day's final words and cried. In 1999, 40 years later, she finally mentioned the existence of these recordings to a music historian, but still didn't give them up. "It's not time yet," she said. "The world isn't ready yet." Margaret Davis died in 2018, at the age of 93. She willed that after her death, the recordings be donated to the Pennsylvania Music Archive. In the spring of 2019, archive staff cataloging materials donated by Margaret Davis found an old reel-to-reel tape. It only said BH Final Recordings, July 16, 1959, on it. When archivist Jennifer Morrison listened to the tape, she couldn't believe what she heard. "Within the first 10 seconds I knew it was Billie Holiday's voice," she would say later, "but what she said shocked me. This wasn't just music, it was a historical document." Morrison immediately called her director, and the recordings were immediately secured. After the recordings were found, comprehensive forensic analyses were conducted to prove their authenticity. First, Voice analysis experts compared Lady Day's voice with her other recordings. Voice analysis expert Dr. Robert Chen from Stanford University stated, "The voice anatomically definitely belongs to Billie Holiday. Vocal cord vibrations, breathing patterns, tonal characteristics match existing recordings 98%. The age test performed on the tape also confirmed it was from 1959. The magnetic tape technology and degradation characteristics pointed to that period. More importantly, the recording device model was identified. 1958 model Ampex 600 portable recorder. It matched exactly with the device model that Margaret Davis's husband Henry owned at that time. These technical details were definitive proof that the recordings weren't fake. The most striking verification came from hospital records. When Metropolitan Hospital archives were checked for records dated July 16, 1959, it was seen that Nurse Margaret Davis was in Lady Day's room for an hour that afternoon, then briefly left the hospital and returned for the evening shift. This timeline was completely consistent with the story Margaret told. The recordings were real, and the world would finally hear Lady Day's final words. After the recordings were verified, Lady Day's accusations about the FBI were compared with federal archives. When documents released under the Freedom of Information Act were examined, shocking results emerged. Almost every detail Lady Day said in the recordings matched FBI files. Dr. Martinez was indeed on the FBI's cooperating doctors list. Documents were found showing that Martinez, who handled Lady Day's treatment between 1947 to 1952, was in regular communication with the FBI. Even more shocking was the FBI's strategy of keeping Lady Day under control under the guise of narcotics enforcement. One of the documents clearly stated, "Subject Holiday's addiction makes her more controllable. This situation can be used to limit strange fruit performances." These documents proved that what Lady Day said in the recordings wasn't fantasy but documented reality. FBI reports about Tallulah Bankhead and other secret relationships also confirmed what Lady Day said in the recordings. The FBI defined these relationships as leverage points. Lady Day's statement in the recordings, "You threatened my lovers," was in the FBI's own files as a tactic. The system really was trying every method to isolate, weaken, and ultimately silence Lady Day. When the recordings were shared with the public in fall 2019, the music world was shocked. Quincy Jones gave his first reaction. "Listening to Billie's final recordings was an emotional devastation for me. That voice, that pain, that truth, it's all there. But what shocked me most were the accusations against the FBI. The system really did kill her." Jones's statement went viral on social media and created global awareness about the recordings. Wynton Marsalis made a more detailed evaluation about the recordings. "These recordings are not just musical, they're a political document. Lady Day was fighting the system even on her deathbed. The final version of Strange Fruit with the new verse she added speaks to today's America too. The system hasn't changed. Only the methods have evolved." Marsalis's comment showed how the recordings were being evaluated in current political context. Other artists also stated they were deeply affected. Alicia Keys said, "I cried listening to Lady Day's final love song. It's so honest, so vulnerable, but at the same time so powerful. It shows us that art is resistance until the very end." Beyoncé shared this message on social media. "Billie Holiday's final recordings remind us, our voice is our weapon, and we must use it forever." The quality of the recordings was quite poor. Hospital room noise, Lady Day's weak voice, and 60 years of degradation had made the recordings almost unintelligible. Sound engineers from Abbey Road Studios were called in to restore the recordings. Project leader Peter Mew said, "This was the most difficult but most meaningful project I've ever worked on. We tried to save every word, every breath, every silence. The restoration process took 6 months. AI-supported sound cleaning technologies were used. Background noise was minimized. Lady Day's voice was clarified, but authenticity was preserved. We didn't make anything artificial," Mew said. "The cracks in Billie's voice, breathing difficulties, even the coughs were preserved. Because these are part of that moment's reality. The most difficult part was the speech section directed at the FBI. Lady Day's voice was so weak and under the influence of morphine that some words were unintelligible. Experts tried to decipher every word using lip-reading techniques and voice forensics. In the final version, 95% of the recordings became clearly understandable. The remaining 5% was supported with subtitles. When musicologists analyzed the recordings in detail, they discovered hidden messages and symbolic references in Lady Day's words and intonations. The new verse she added to Strange Fruit was particularly noteworthy. With needles and badges and pharmacy was a multi-layered metaphor. Needles represented both heroin needles and medical manipulation, badges represented police and FBI, and pharmacy represented systemic poisoning. Music history professor Dr. Angela Morrison from Columbia University noticed that the tone changes in the recording were also meaningful. When Lady Day talks about the FBI, her voice doesn't tremble with fear, it strengthens with anger. This is a conscious tonal emphasis. She's conveying the tension between fear and determination through voice tone. This observation showed what a conscious artist Lady Day was even in her final moments. The forbidden song metaphor in the final love song was also much discussed. Some experts thought this was a reference to Strange Fruit, while others argued Lady Day meant her forbidden loves. Literature professor Dr. James Chen from Harvard commented, "Probably both. Lady Day's genius is here. With one metaphor she encompasses both her music and her love, both her art and her identity." Lady Day's official death certificate listed the cause of death as cirrhosis of the liver and cardiac failure. However, the FBI accusations and poisoning implications in the recordings questioned the official cause of death. When medical historians re-examined the 1959 autopsy reports, they found interesting details. The autopsy report noted that there were unusual toxin levels in Lady Day's body, but this detail was never followed up. It was also noted that the liver damage was too severe to be explained by alcohol alone. Toxicology expert Dr. Sarah Williams from Johns Hopkins said, "When we compare the medical knowledge of 1959 with today's knowledge, the possibility emerges that there may not have been only natural causes in Lady Day's death." Lady Day's words in the recordings, "Now I'm dying here and I know you're happy about it too," strengthened the possibility that her death was expected and even desired. While some conspiracy theorists claimed Lady Day was deliberately killed in the hospital, there was no definitive evidence. However, the recording showed at least this: Lady Day saw herself as a murder victim. Margaret Davis's granddaughter Jessica Davis made a statement to the media after the recordings were found in 2019. "I finally understand why my grandmother kept these recordings for 60 years. Sharing this information in those days could have put her in danger, but she also wanted to keep the promise she made to Lady Day. As she willed, she ensured it came out at the right time." Jessica recounted that her grandmother talked about the recordings in her final years. "She told me, 'Billie gave me a mission, to tell the truth, but sometimes the truth must wait for its time to come.' Even when she died at 93, she was still thinking about these recordings. One of her last words was, 'I promised Billie.'" This story showed what a faithful custodian Margaret was. Margaret Davis's family refused to profit from the recordings. "My grandmother didn't keep these for money," Jessica said. "She kept them for history, for truth. We'll do the same." The recordings were donated to the Pennsylvania Music Archive and made accessible to all humanity. This decision was deemed appropriate to Margaret's and Lady Day's spirit. After the recordings were published, many modern artists created new works inspired by Lady Day's final words. Kendrick Lamar released a track called Strange Fruit 2020 on his 2020 album and used the verse Lady Day added as a sample. What Lady Day said in 1959 is still valid in 2020. "The system looks different, but the result is the same," Lamar said. Alicia Keys reinterpreted Lady Day's final love song. When she sang this song at her 2021 concert, she couldn't hold back her tears. "This song is not just Lady Day's story, it's the story of all lovers condemned to silence," Keys said. The modern version of the song won the Grammy for Best Vocal Performance and carried Lady Day's legacy to new generations. Beyoncé's Freedom's Price track on her 2022 album was also directly influenced by Lady Day's recordings. Lady Day's words, "Before they killed me, they tried to make me forget who I was," were used as a sample in the song's bridge section. This use went viral on social media and millions of people discovered Lady Day's final recordings. The discovery of the recordings also resonated greatly in the academic world. Yale University organized a special symposium on the recordings. The conference, titled Billie Holiday's Final Testimony, Art, Politics, and Resistance, lasted 3 days, and academics from around the world participated. Experts from fields of musicology, history, sociology, law, and psychology analyzed the recordings from different perspectives. Michelle Chen from Stanford emphasized the importance of the recordings for trauma studies. Lady Day's final recordings show how trauma victims try to establish narrative control even in their final moments. She's on her deathbed but still wants to be the author of her own story. This is an extremely powerful example of resistance from a psychological perspective.
Chen's article was published in the Journal of Trauma Studies and received many citations in the field. Professor David Martinez from Harvard Law School examined the legal implications of the recordings. If Lady Day's allegations about the FBI are true, and documents support this, this constitutes an example of state-sponsored systematic oppression. Can justice still be sought 60 years after her death? We must discuss this question. Martinez's research caught the attention of the Congressional Black Caucus, and new investigation demands came about the FBI's past practices.
The Pennsylvania Music Archive used the latest technology to preserve the recordings. While the original reel-to-reel tape was stored in a special temperature and humidity-controlled room, digital copies were made permanent using blockchain technology. These recordings are humanity's common heritage, said Archive Director Thomas Wright. We're taking every precaution to ensure future generations can access them. The Library of Congress added the recordings to its culturally significant recordings collection. The Smithsonian Institution prepared an interactive exhibition around the recordings. Visitors could sit in a replica of Lady Day's hospital room, listen to the recordings, and examine visual materials explaining the context of the era. Through collaboration with Google Arts and Culture, the recordings were turned into an online museum. People from around the world could visit the website to listen to the recordings, read experts' comments, and follow Lady Day's final 24 hours on a timeline. The platform received 50 million visitors since its launch in 2020. After the recordings were published and Lady Day's allegations about the FBI were heard by the public, no official statement came from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This silence received intense criticism from civil rights activists and journalists. The FBI isn't denying the accusations because they don't have arguments to deny them, said ACLU lawyer Maria Rodriguez. Everything is clear in the documents. It's time to be accountable for the past. Former FBI agent and whistleblower Robert Thompson spoke about the recordings. It's a fact that in the 1940s and 1950s the FBI systematically oppressed black artists, especially artists with political messages. What Lady Day described in her recordings is consistent with the standard operating procedures of that era. For the FBI to deny these would be to reject historical facts. In 2020, the Congressional Black Caucus requested an official investigation to examine the FBI's historical practices toward Lady Day and other black artists. The American people have the right to know the truth, said Representative Barbara Lee. Billie Holiday's final recordings show us that systemic racism is not just today's reality but also our histories. Accountability is essential. In 2020, following the killing of George Floyd during Black Lives Matter protests, Lady Day's final recordings took on new meaning. Protesters wrote Lady Day's words, "They lynched my people, now they're lynching me," on banners. These words became a symbol of systemic violence stretching from 1959 to 2020. Musician-activist Brittany Howard reinterpreted Lady Day's final recordings during the protests. Lady Day said it 60 years ago, "The system hasn't changed, only the methods have. From ropes to handcuffs, from trees to street corners, but the result is the same. Black bodies are still in danger." Howard's performance went viral on social media and millions rediscovered Lady Day's message. In an article published in the New York Times, journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones wrote, "Billie Holiday's final recordings remind us, artists have always been the system's first target because they tell the truth. Strange Fruit in 1959, I Can't Breathe in 2020. Songs change, but the struggle continues." When medical experts listened to the recordings, they could make inferences about Lady Day's health condition from her voice. Dr. Emily Watson from Johns Hopkins said, "Lady Day's breathing pattern is consistent with advanced liver damage and fluid accumulation. But at the same time, the morphine effect is also very clear in her voice. Her speech is slow, sometimes she mixes words together." The most striking medical observation was Lady Day's increasing fatigue throughout the recording. While her voice was relatively strong in the first recording, by the third recording it had almost become a whisper. This progression shows us that Lady Day was pushing her body's limits. Singing was consuming her last energy, but she continued anyway. "This is an incredible demonstration of will," Dr. Watson said. The time around 4 p.m. when the recordings were made was when Lady Day's morphine dosage was effective. According to hospital records, she had taken morphine at noon that day. Her ability to think this clearly even under morphine shows how strong Lady Day's mental structure was, said neurologist Dr. James Park. She needed morphine to control her pain, but relied on willpower to control her mind. When musicologists analyzed the recordings, they were amazed by the technical details in Lady Day's final performances. Even though her voice was weak, her tonal choices and emotional expressions were still perfect. Professor wawsi kontrasachemploits, what mupexplicor tinctrapalin was prov. Sarah Johnson from Berklee College of Music said, Lady Day's vibrato was almost non-existent, but the straight tones she put in its place were so emotionally intense that vibrato wasn't needed. This minimalist approach actually creates a more powerful effect. The tempo choice in the final version of Strange Fruit was also debated. Lady Day had sung the song much slower than normal. This slowness doesn't just come from physical weakness but from a conscious artistic choice. Johnson said, she's giving more weight to each word. Each silence becomes more meaningful. This may be the most powerful interpretation of this song. The melodic structure of the final love song also impressed academics. The melody Lady Day composed was simple but unforgettable. It follows jazz harmony rules but is also very personal, said Professor Michael Chen from Yale. This melody carries Lady Day's musical signature, blues tones, unexpected intervals, emotional intensity. Even on her deathbed, her musical genius hadn't disappeared. When trauma psychologists listened to the recordings, they made important observations about Lady Day's psychological state in her final moments. Professor Jennifer Morrison from UCLA said, Lady Day's recordings are a classic example of narrative control. Throughout her life, others wrote her story. The media, FBI, record companies, but in her final moments, she wants to be the author of her own story. This is a very important healing step for trauma victims. The voice tone changes in the recordings were also meaningful psychologically. When talking about the FBI, Lady Day's voice doesn't tremble with fear, it strengthens with anger. This is a transition from victim position to accuser position, a moment of psychological empowerment, Morrison said. This observation showed that Lady Day maintained her spirit of resistance even in her final moments. The most striking psychological detail was the piece at the end of the recordings. After Lady Day says what she has to say, there's a relaxation in her voice, as if she's been freed from a great burden. This closure is very important in trauma treatment. Lady Day created her own closure, Professor Morrison said. This observation showed that the recordings were not just expression for Lady Day but also therapy. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of Lady Day's final recordings was the message she left for future generations. In her speech directed at the FBI, she had said, "These recordings will come out one day, and then the world will see." These sentences showed Lady Day's faith in the future and her confidence that truth would eventually emerge. The words "Remember my music, remember my name" in the final love song also directly addressed future generations. Lady Day knew she could die physically, but her music would live forever, said music historian Professor David Williams. These recordings were the final step in her immortality plan. She wrote herself into history books. Modern artists seem to have received this message. In a 2021 interview, Lizzo said, "Lady Day's final recordings taught me that artists are historians. What we say will remain for future generations. This is a great responsibility but also great power." This perspective showed how Lady Day's legacy lives on. While making the recordings publicly available, the Pennsylvania Music Archive made special efforts to ensure Lady Day's message reached as many people as possible. The recordings were published online for free. "These recordings belong to all humanity," said archive director Thomas Wright. "Selling them for money would be a betrayal of Lady Day's message." The recordings were translated into 15 different languages and supported with subtitles. They were made freely accessible on platforms like Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Within the first year, the recordings were listened to 100 million times. Lady Day's voice had finally reached the entire world 60 years later. Additionally, special guides were prepared for use as educational material in schools. Material titled "Billie Holiday's Final Recordings for Teachers" showed how they could be used in history, music, and civil rights classes. This way, new generations could learn Lady Day's story and message. Those 3 songs recorded in room 512 on July 16, 1959, after waiting 60 years in silence, finally reached the world. What Billie Holiday recorded with her last energy under morphine, struggling to breathe, one day before her death, now lives on in history books, music archives, and the hearts of millions. Lady Day's final recordings continue to exist, not just as a musical treasure, but as a resistance manifesto, a call for justice, and a message to the future. The words she added to Strange Fruit, "They lynched my people, now they're lynching me," echo today in Black Lives Matter slogans. Her accusations directed at the FBI have become a symbol of the fight against systemic injustice.
Her final love song gives courage to all hearts afraid to express themselves. At the end of the recordings, one day before her death, Lady Day said, "Maybe I'll die, but this voice will never die." 60 years later, it became clear how true these words were. Billie Holiday's voice was silenced, but her message is still being heard. Those final recordings in room 5112 are proof that her soul, not her body, is immortal. With each listening, Lady Day comes back to life. With each sharing, her message strengthens. Each new generation draws inspiration from her courage. This is perhaps the greatest victory an artist can achieve, after death, for their voice to continue living. Lady Day's final recordings remind us, true art never dies, it only transforms and is reborn in every generation.